We all make jokes approximately it. Greenland is ice. Iceland is inexperienced. It's one of those amusing statistics you share at events, a quirk of geography that makes people snigger. But what if I advised you that call wasn't just some random mistake or coincidence? What if I told you it become deliberate? What if the call Greenland changed into truly the maximum a hit advertising and marketing lie in medieval records? A con so audacious it convinced hundreds of families to sail into the unknown closer to a frozen desert they believed could be paradise. This is the tale of Erik the Red, a Viking outlaw, a murderer, and perhaps the sector's first advertising and marketing genius. This is the tale of how one man's desperation and foxy created a colony built on deception, blood, and damaged promises. This is the tale of the Viking Fyre Festival. To apprehend how this all occurred, we want to head back to the 12 months 982 in Iceland. Iceland itself changed into a noticeably new settlement at this point. The Norse had only been there for approximately a century, and life turned into difficult. The island was volcanic. The winters were brutal and assets had been scarce. It turned into a place where disputes could flip deadly and immediately, where honor meant the whole lot, and wherein blood feuds should closing generations. Erik Thorvaldsson, who could later be known as Erik the Red because of his fiery crimson hair and beard, turned into living in Iceland together with his family. He wasn't born there. Erik turned into absolutely, born in Norway, but his father, Thorvald Asvason, had been exiled from Norway for committing manslaughter. So, the circle of relatives had fled to Iceland, hoping to begin clean in this harsh new land. But Erik, it appears, had inherited his father's temper. He became recognized to be proud, quick to anger, and unwilling to backpedal from a fight. These weren't always horrific qualities in Viking tradition, Vikings' reputable strength and braveness, but Erik's temper could in the end be his downfall, at the least in Iceland. The hassle started out over something that seems almost trivial via our requirements nowadays. Erik had a few slaves, and those slaves brought on a landslide that damaged his buddy's assets. The neighbor, a man named Valkioff, was understandably disappointed, but in preference to simply annoying reimbursement or taking Erik to courtroom, Vio's pal, a man named Ahoff the Foul, decided to take topics into his own palms. Killed Erik's slaves as revenge. Now, in Viking society, this turned into a severe offense. Slaves were assets, and killing someone's property was basically theft and destruction. Erik became livid. He wasn't going to let this insult stand, so Erik did what any hot-headed Viking could do. He hunted down Elof the chicken and killed him. He also killed another guy named Holg Rafn, in all likelihood due to the fact Rafn was associated with Eyjolf or had insulted Erik in some manner. The sagas are not completely clear on all of the details, but the result turned into the equal. 2 men have been lifeless with the aid of Erik's hand. This brought on a blood feud. The households of the lifeless men demanded justice. They took Erik to court, the local meeting, the factor in which disputes have been settled in step with Viking regulation. Erik changed into found guilty of manslaughter. The punishment wasn't execution or imprisonment. In Viking Iceland, a most extreme punishment became outlaw. Erik was declared an outlaw, which supposed he turned into banished from his domestic district for 3 years. He needed to depart, and if absolutely everyone discovered him inside the forbidden areas throughout that time, that they had the legal right to kill him without effect. Erik moved to every other part of Iceland, to some islands off the coast, hoping to lay low and wait out his exile, but Erik's temper hadn't cooled. He lent a few precious timber beams, crucial building substances, and a place with few trees to a person named Thorgest. When Erik later asked for the beams back, Thorgest refused to go back them. Another dispute, some other insult, and over again Erik's response became violence. Erik went to Thorgest's farm and took his beams again by way of force. Thorgest chased after him. A combat broke out. In the chaos, Erik killed Thorgest and numerous of Thorgest's sons. Now Erik had even more blood on his fingers. Thorgest's circle of relatives demanded justice. Once more, Erik became taken to the thing. Once again, he changed into found responsible. But this time the sentence turned into harsher. Erik the Red became declared a complete outlaw, not simply from a district, but from all of Iceland. He had 3 years to leave the island completely. If he stayed, he turned into a useless man. So there, Erik turned into a man in his 32nds, a husband and father, now a time killer with nowhere to head. He could not return to Norway. His father had been exiled from there. Iceland had simply kicked him out. He wished a new domestic, a brand new land, a clean start. But in which? Erik had heard tales. Sailors once in a while mentioned land to the west of Iceland. Decades in advance, a person named Gunjornjorn Olin were blown off direction for the duration of a voyage and claimed to have seen islands or a coastline a ways to the west. No one had stricken to explore it well. It turned into too a ways, too dangerous, too unknown. But for Erik, a person, and not using A options, the unknown turned into his most effective alternative. In the summer season of 982, Erik accrued a group, geared up a ship, and sailed west into the open Atlantic. He became venturing into waters that few had dared to go, heading toward a land that may not even exist. But Erik was determined, and desperation, as we will see, could make a person very creative. After days at sea, struggling with waves and wind, Erik and his crew in the end spotted land. It was a huge island, some distance larger than Iceland. Erik sailed along its Japanese coast, attempting to find an area to land. But what he found wasn't promising. The eastern shore was a wall of ice, glaciers tumbling into the sea, mountains blanketed in snow, a landscape that seemed thoroughly inhospitable. But Erik didn't give up. He sailed across the southern tip of the island and up the western coast, and there he determined something different. The western fjords have been nevertheless bloodless, nevertheless harsh, but they had been much less icy. There were patches of inexperienced in the valleys throughout summertime. There was grass. There have been sheltered bays. There were seals and fish. It wasn't paradise, however it changed into survivable. Erik spent the subsequent 3 years exploring this new land. He mapped the coastline. He discovered the satisfactory spots for agreement. He hunted and fished. He survived. And at some stage in the one's 3 years by myself in that big frozen desert, Erik began to think. He concept about his destiny. He thought approximately his family returned in Iceland. He concept approximately what it would take to construct a new lifestyles on this vicinity. And then Erik had a concept, a first-rate, devious, audacious idea. Erik realized that he couldn't settle this land on my own. It became too large, too harsh. He would want assist. He might need farmers, craftsmen, workers. He might want a community. But who, in their right thoughts, would voluntarily sail into the unknown to settle a frozen island? Erik understood human psychology. He understood that humans are interested in possibility to the promise of something better. He understood that branding topics, and he understood that if he instructed human beings the reality that this new land turned into a desolate, icy rock, barely suitable for human habitation, nobody would come. So Erik decided he could lie. He would rebrand this frozen, desolate tract. He could provide it. A name that might make it sound attractive, inviting, fertile. He might name it Greenland. Think approximately that for a moment. Erik the Red, a convicted killer in exile, changed into approximately to launch the medieval global's first advertising and marketing campaign. He become going to promote people on a vacation spot he knew changed into nothing like its call advised. He became going to use the electricity of branding to trick determined land-hungry families into risking the whole lot for a lie. When Erik's 3-year exile ended, he backed to Iceland. He came back with stories. He talked about the brand new land he discovered. He defined it as green, fertile, full of ability. He known as it Greenland. The name itself became a promise. It recommended lush pastures, exact farming, prosperity. And right here's the issue. Iceland within the overdue 10th century was struggling. The populace was growing. Land becomes scarce. Feuds had been steady. Winters had been getting harsher. Farms had been failing. People had been hungry. People have been determined for a fresh start, for brand new opportunities, for a danger at a higher lifestyles. Erik's timing was perfect. He wasn't just promoting an area. He'd become selling hope. He went from farm to farm, from village to village, telling his tale. He showed humans the course. He promised them land as an awful lot as they might paintings. He painted a photograph of an area where they could be unfastened from the feuds and crowding of Iceland, in which they may build something new. And human beings believed him. Why wouldn't they? Erik turned into a recognized figure. He become from a distinguished family. He was a professional navigator who had survived 3 years in this new land. And most importantly, he had given it a call that counseled it became really worth the threat. 25 ships organized to set sail within the summer season of 985. 25 ships full of families, cattle, tools, resources. Hundreds of human beings, perhaps as many as 500. Ready to stake their futures on Erik's promise. Imagine the scene. The docks crowded with human beings announcing goodbye to cherished ones they may in no way see once more. Children excited for journey, women worried however hopeful, men determined to say their share of this new Greenland, ships loaded down with the entirety these families owned. Every ownership, every animal, each seed for planting, and then they set off. 25 ships cruising west into the Atlantic, following Erik the Red towards Greenland. But the Atlantic Ocean is not kind. It's one of the most dangerous bodies of water on Earth, in particular in small Viking ships. The adventure from Iceland to Greenland turned into kind of 450 miles of open ocean. There have been no landmarks, no GPS, no weather forecasts. Sailors navigated by using the sun and stars, by way of the flight of birds, by way of the coloration of the water, and that they had been totally on the mercy of the climate. The fleet ran into storms, massive waves, howling winds. Ships were separated, some have been blown off direction, some took on water, some truly vanished below the waves. Of the 25 ships that left Iceland, best 14 made it to Greenland. 11 ships were lost, that's nearly half the fleet. Hundreds of people drowned, families were torn apart, dreams sank to the lowest of the sea. But the survivors pressed on. They had come a long way to turn returned. They had nothing to go back to. So after they sooner or later noticed the coast of Greenland, after they sailed into the western fjords, they have to have felt relief. They had made it, they had survived, and then they noticed the fact. Greenland turned into no longer inexperienced. It became ice. It became rock. It turned into a harsh, unforgiving panorama that slightly resembled the paradise Erik had defined. Yes, there had been some patches of grass in the valleys. Yes, the fjord supplied some shelter. However, this became not the luxurious farmland they had imagined. This became an area where survival might be a consistent struggle. They had been conned. They were lied to. They had risked the whole thing, lost pals and own family at sea, and arrived at a frozen desert. But what should they do? They could not pass again. They had no ships able to making the go-back adventure safely. They had burned their bridges in Iceland. They had been caught. So they did the only component they could do. They settled, they constructed, they survived. Erik the Red established the first agreement at an area he known as Brattahlid, which became the capital of the Greenland colony. Other settlers spread out alongside the western coast, claiming fjords and valleys, constructing farms and homes. They raised sheep and livestock. They hunted seals and whales. They traded walrus ivory and furs. They made it work, and Erik had become the undisputed chief of this new colony. He changed into the chieftain, the founder, the man who had delivered them there. Despite the lies, regardless of the losses, Erik commanded appreciate. He had, in any case, survived 3 years on my own in this location. He knew the land. He knew a way to live right here. The Greenland colony grew. At its height, it had around 5,000 inhabitants spread throughout 2 essential settlements, the Eastern Agreement and the Western Agreement. That is confusing because the Western Agreement become clearly northeast of the Eastern settlement. However, it truly is Viking naming logic for you. The colonists constructed church buildings. They hooked up alternate routes returned to Iceland and Norway. They even dispatched expeditions in addition west to what they called Vinland, which we now recognize was North America. Erik's son, Leif Erikson, would grow to be well known for being one of the first Europeans to set foot in the New World centuries earlier than Columbus. But existence in Greenland was by no means easy. The climate turned into harsh. The growing season became quick. The colonists were absolutely depending on alternate for things like iron and timber, which Greenland lacked. They were remoted, reduced off from the relaxation of the Norse International for months at a time, at some stage in winter. And there was always the understanding, the unstated fact, that they were tricked, that the call Greenland changed into a lie, that Erik the Red had sold them a dream and added a nightmare. But right here's the fascinating thing. The lie worked, now not just in getting humans to come, but in keeping them there. The call Greenland have become a source of satisfaction. It was their land. They had built it. They had survived here. The name became a declare, a defiant announcement that they'd tamed this region, that they had made it theirs. And for hundreds of years the colony endured. It survived plague, climate trade, war with the indigenous Inuit humans, and the sluggish decline of change with Europe. The Greenland Norse had been a number of the toughest, maximum resilient people in medieval history, but ultimately the colony failed. By the 15th century, the settlements had been deserted. The ultimate Norse Greenlanders both died out or left. The motives are nonetheless debated. Climate exchange made farming even tougher. The Little Ice Age introduced colder winters and shorter summers. Trade routes collapsed. The Black Death decimated Europe and disrupted the networks the Greenlanders depended on. Conflict with the Inuit expanded. The colonists may additionally have come to be too remoted, too rigid of their methods, not able to evolve. But for almost 500 years, Greenland turned into domestic to a Norse colony based on a lie. And that lie, that advertising trick, that rebranding of a frozen, desolate tract as inexperienced paradise was the work of one guy, Erik the Red, murderer, exile, con artist, founding father. Erik himself lived a protracted life through Viking requirements. He died of ailment, probable across the year 1003, simply as Christianity beginning to spread through Greenland. His wife Theodilt had converted, and she famously built a small church, refusing to sleep with Erik until he too converted. Erik by no means did. He remained a pagan to the end, stubborn and proud, just as he had constantly been. And in a way, Erik's tale is the perfect embodiment of the Viking spirit. Vikings have been explorers, warriors, investors, and yes, occasionally liars and thieves. They were opportunists who noticed the world now not as it turned into, but as it may be. They were willing to take full-size dangers for the promise of something better. They were survivors. Erik the Red noticed a frozen island and called it Greenland. He noticed a determined populace in Iceland and sold them a dream. He satisfied 500 people to danger their lives on his phrase. 11 ships sank, hundreds died, however 14 ships made it. A colony became born, and for 5 centuries people lived, worked, loved, and died in Greenland, all because one guy understood the power of a call. The tale of Erik the Red in Greenland doesn't end with the founding of the colony. In fact, in lots of ways, the real tale is just starting. Because what came about subsequent exhibits even more about the character of this lie, approximately the resilience of the individuals who fell for it, and about how records recalls and reshapes the truth. Let's start with the survivors, those 14 ships that made it to Greenland in 985. Imagine being on one of those vessels. You've simply survived a harrowing ocean crossing. You've watched ships disappear in storms. You've visible humans you knew, maybe human beings you loved, swallowed with the aid of the ocean. You've continued days of terror, bloodless starvation, and uncertainty. And then you defiantly arrive. You step onto the shore of Greenland, and also you recognize you've been offered a fable. What do? Do you confront Erik? Do you demand to move? Lower back? Some probable did. The sagas trace at tensions, at arguments, at anger, but the practical reality became undeniable. These households had devoted the whole thing. They had bought their farms in Iceland, packed their belongings, introduced their animals. They had nowhere else to head. The ships that brought them were damaged, exhausted. The crews were depleted. Turning round and sailing return to Iceland without delay wasn't in choice. And although it were, what might they go back to? They had left Iceland due to the fact life there has been hard. Going back supposed admitting defeat, returning to a place where they'd no land, no potentialities, no future. So they stayed and they tailored. And this is wherein the tale turns into much less about Erik the liar and greater about the normal folks who made his lie right into a fact. The Norse Greenlanders had been extraordinarily innovative. They quickly learned that traditional Icelandic farming wouldn't paintings in Greenland. The developing season was too quick. The soil changed into too bad. So they adjusted. They focused on livestock that could survive the cold, sheep, goats, and farm animals, but in smaller numbers than in Iceland. They relied closely on looking. Seals had become a staple. The colonists hunted them for meat, for oil, for skins. They hunted caribou inside the indoors. They hunted walrus for their valuable ivory tusks, which became Greenland's #1 export to Europe. They fished. The waters around Greenland have been wealthy with fish, and the colonists became professional fishermen. They built boats, set nets, and discovered to read the sea just as their ancestors had. They additionally traded with the indigenous peoples. They encountered the Norse known as them Skrælings, a time period that likely encompassed both the Dorset humans and later the Thu humans, ancestors of the modern-day Inuit. The courting between the Norse and the indigenous peoples became complicated. There's evidence of change. Norse artifacts had been observed in Inuit sites and Inuit artifacts in Norse websites. However, there may be also proof of warfare. The sagas referred to skirmishes, raids, and mutual distrust. The North saw themselves as advanced, as civilized Christians, bringing order to a wild land. The indigenous peoples noticed the Norse as strange invaders on their conventional searching grounds. This anxiety would simmer for centuries and may have contributed to the eventual collapse of the Norse colony. But in those early years, the colony grew. Erik installed himself at Brattahlid, and other chieftains claimed their very own territories. They built long houses, barns, and churches. They created a society modeled on what they'd known in Iceland, with a thing for settling disputes, a machine of laws, and a social hierarchy. And right here's the crucial part. They made it paintings. Against all odds, in one of the cruelest environments on Earth, the North Greenlanders constructed a functioning society. They had farms, churches, and alternate networks. They raised households, they celebrated fairs, they advised tales, they lived. And the name Greenland caught. It had become the identification of the colony. It became a name that represented no longer what the land changed into, but what the people had manufactured from it. It became a defiant claim. Yes, it is bloodless. Yes, it is tough. But it is ours, and we name it Greenland. Erik the Red himself became a legendary parent even in his own lifetime. He changed into the founder, the chieftain, the man who had led them to this new international. His own family had become the most outstanding in Greenland. His son, Leif Erikson, might go directly to discover even further west, turning into the first recognized European to attain North America around the 12 months 1000. Leif's journey to Vinland is a tale in itself. According to the sagas, Leif heard tales from a trader named Bijai Hrolfsson, who have been blown. Off path and spotted land to the west of Greenland, Leif decided to investigate. He accrued a team, sailed west, and found a land wealthy with timber, wild grapes, and salmon. He referred to as it Vinland, that means wineland or meadowland. Lifestyles set up a small agreement there, possibly in what's now Newfoundland. Archaeological evidence from an area referred to as Landsamaras confirms that the Norse did indeed reach North America centuries earlier than Columbus. But the Vinland colony didn't final. The distance from Greenland became too superb. The indigenous peoples had been adversarial. After some years, the Norse abandoned Finland and back to Greenland. But the truth that they attempted, the reality that they explored even similarly into the unknown, tells you something approximately the spirit of those people. They were the youngsters of Erik's lie. However, they'd made that lie their fact. They had embraced the identity of Greenlanders. They had grew to become a con into a lifestyle. Back in Greenland, existence persisted. The colony reached its top inside the 12th and 13th centuries. By then, there have been around 5,000 Norse Greenlanders residing in main settlement areas. The Jap Agreement, which became in reality within the southwest, changed into the bigger and extra rich. This is wherein Brattahl become placed. The western settlement becomes smaller, greater far away, or even harsher. The Greenlanders built wonderful systems. The ruins nonetheless exist nowadays. Stone church buildings, a few with stunning carvings, massive farm homes with thick turf walls for insulation, barns for cattle. They even had a bishop. Greenland was officially part of the Catholic Church, and the Pope appointed bishops to oversee the religious existence of the colony. The reality that Greenland, one of the remotest outposts of Christendom, had its own bishop, suggests how incorporated the colony had emerged as into the medieval European global. Trade turned into crucial. Greenland had no iron, no timber, and no grain. These had to be imported from Iceland and Norway. In change, the Greenlanders exported walrus ivory, walrus conceal rope, which become prized for its power. Polar undergo skins, stay polar bears as distinct items for European royalty, and furs. Walrus ivory changed into particularly valuable as it turned into an alternative to elephant ivory, which was tougher to gain, but trade became precarious. Ships will be lost at sea, routes will be disrupted, and the Greenlanders were entirely dependent on preserving these connections. In the early 14th century, things began to head wrong. First, the climate started to alternate. The medieval heat period, which had made the preliminary settlement of Greenland viable, become finishing. The Little Ice Age become beginning. Temperatures dropped. Winters had become longer and harsher. Ice multiplied. The already quick developing season shrank even similarly. Livestock died. Hay harvests failed. Survival had become even tougher. Second, alternate routes started to fall apart. The Black Death struck Europe within the mid-4th century, killing possibly a third of the population. Norway, which had been Greenland's #1 buying and selling associate, changed into devastated. The Norwegian crown lost hobby in retaining distant colonies. Ships stopped coming. The Greenlanders were more and more remoted. Third, the marketplace for walrus ivory collapsed. Elephant ivory from Africa became more available as European exchange networks extended. Walrus ivory lost its price. Greenland's #1 export turned into now worthless. And fourth, the relationship with the indigenous Thu people, who had been increasing into Greenland from the north, became extra strained. The Thu were better adapted to the Arctic environment than the Norse. They used kayaks, dog sleds, and sophisticated-looking strategies. They thrived in conditions that the Norse struggled with. There's proof of increasing struggle. Norse artifacts display signs and symptoms of raids. The western settlement, the smaller and extra far away of the two, changed into abandoned around 1360. We don't know exactly why. The farms had been truly left in the back of, animals nonetheless in their pens, suggesting a surprising departure. Were they wiped out through the Thule? Did they flee to the eastern settlement? Did they starve? We don't know. The eastern settlement hung on longer, however, via the early 15th century, it too became failing. Ships from Europe stopped coming altogether. The closing recorded contact with Greenland turned into a wedding in 1408. After that, silence. When European explorers in the end again to Greenland inside the late 15th and early 16th centuries, they observed the Norse settlements deserted. The farms were ruins. The churches have been empty. The people had been long gone. Some explorers determined frozen bodies in Norse garb, the ultimate remnants of a vanished colony. What took place to the final Greenlanders? That's one of records' outstanding mysteries. Did they die of hunger and disease? Did they depart some way, making the dangerous journey again to Iceland or Norway? Did they intermar with the Inuit and lose their Norse identification? Archaeological and genetic evidence indicates some mixing did occur, but the Norse colony as an awesome entity certainly vanished. And here's the tragic irony. The Inuit thrived in Greenland. They still live there today. Greenland is now part of the Kingdom of Denmark. However, the majority of its population is Inuit. They adapted to the surroundings, in ways the Norse in no way ought to or would. The Norse clung to their European methods, to their farm animals, to their church buildings, to their identification as Christians and farmers. They refused to completely undertake Inuit technologies and life, even if the ones might have helped them continue to exist. Their cultural stubbornness, their refusal to adapt may also have doomed them. So what does the tale of Erik the Red in Greenland educate us? First, it shows the electricity of branding and advertising and marketing. Erik understood that notion matters. He understood that a name ought to shape fact. By calling the land Greenland, he made it appealing. He made it seem like impossibility. And that call has lasted over 1,000 years. Even nowadays, Greenland is referred to as Greenland even though it's by and large ice. The lie became the reality, at least in name. Second, it shows the resilience of humans. The folks that settled Greenland knew they were deceived, however they made the exceptional of it. They adapted. They survived for nearly 500 years in one of the cruelest places on Earth. That's in splendid success. These weren't simply victims of a con. They had been pioneers, survivors, builders. Third, it indicates the boundaries of adaptability. The Norse Greenlanders were resilient, however they were not flexible sufficient. They hung on to their European identity too tightly. They didn't analyze from the indigenous peoples around them. And ultimately, that lack of ability to fully adapt may additionally have been their downfall. And fourth, it reminds us that records is complete of uncomfortable truths. We like to think about explorers and colonizers as heroes, as brave adventurers spreading civilization, but the fact is often messier. Erik the Red turned into a killer and a liar. The Greenland colony became based on deception and desperation. The Norse Greenlanders displaced indigenous peoples and exploited the land. And yet they were also normal humans trying to build lifestyles, trying to survive, seeking to create something lasting. History is complex. People are complex. And the tale of Greenland is a great instance of that complexity. Today, Greenland is in the news again. Climate trade is melting its ice sheet at an alarming rate. The call Greenland, Erik's lie, is becoming more accurate. Parts of Greenland are turning inexperienced as temperatures upward thrust and glaciers retreat. It's a sour irony. The land that changed into named inexperienced as a trick might surely become green. However, for all the incorrect reasons. Greenland is also politically big. It has enormous herbal resources, uncommon earth minerals, oil, and gas that are turning into reachable because the ice melts. Countries around the sector, such as America, China, and Russia, are interested by Greenland's destiny. There's been talk of independence from Denmark. There's been speak of purchasing Greenland, a proposal that induced global controversy. And through all of this, the Inuit people of Greenland, the descendants of the Thule who outlasted the Norse, are putting forward their rights and their identity. They are those who surely made Greenland their domestic. They are the ones who adapted and survived. So when we look again at Erik the Red, when we think about his lie and the colony it created, we ought to preserve a couple of truths immediately. Yes, he turned into a con artist. Yes, he deceived human beings. Yes, humans died because of his lie. But also, sure, he based a colony that lasted half of a millennium. Yes, he enabled the primary European exploration of North America. Yes, he created a lifestyle and an identification that still resonates nowadays. Erik the Red turned into a complex figure and a complex tale. He became a product of his time, a Viking in each sense of the phrase. Violent, foxy, formidable, and bold, he saw an opportunity and seized it. He bent the fact to serve his desires, and in doing so he modified history. The tale of Greenland is a story approximately the power of names, the resilience of people, the harshness of nature, and the stubbornness of lifestyle. It's a tale approximately what occurs when desperation meets opportunity. It's a tale about survival and failure. It's a tale about a lie that had become a legend, and it all commenced with a purple-haired killer, standing on a frozen shore, searching out at a desolate landscape and finding out to name it inexperienced. This is John, and this is the Cinematics History Tales channel. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because whilst the history books are written, you may need to be most of the few who saw it coming.